Today we're going to be talking about supplier return, some of the scenarios that can happen, some of the best ways that we can go down to handle these scenarios that happen when we get returned defective items, too much of an item, sometimes inordinate items that we don't want in the first place. So let's take a look at this here. And I've got everyone muted right now. If we've got any questions, we can go ahead and unmute some people and open it up at the end here and handle those questions. Okay. Okay, so the agenda today here is going over some of the return scenarios, some of the different types of returns that we may, instances, some of the things we may come across when we want to do one of these returns to our customers. How to return items or item quantities that you did not order. How to process a defective item that is returned by the customer. There's kind of a different way of doing a return to make sure that that doesn't go into your stock on hand available inventory. If they're returning a defective item, we obviously don't want to sell it again to someone else. Unless they know it's a defective item, they're okay with that. But we don't want to. We want to keep that separate from our normal, regular stock on hand inventory. How to create the defective parts report, and in doing so, clear the defective items inventory. Perhaps we're going to use that to send back to our supplier to get credit on our account, something like that. How to actually return those defective items to a supplier. Every supplier is a little bit different, so we might have to take that with a little bit of generalities in there. And then, of course, as always, we've got our Learn More page with the knowledge base articles and the corresponding webinars that we've done on these sort of topics and any sort of training videos that we have available. And make sure that you guys use those resources. You know, we really appreciate that you guys join us here in the morning. You're the fuel for our webinar fire, so to speak. So we really appreciate you guys taking the time to come do this. But make sure that you take a time to keep an eye on the Feature Fixes browser in Paladin. We always put our new knowledge base articles, new webinars, training videos, that sort of thing. We usually throw up a little plug piece for them on that little window. So keep an eye on that window, do an occasional search. Make sure you're using these resources that are available to you and actively pursuing them, not just waiting for them to come to you. Because you can really kind of take your own knowledge of Paladin to the next level without having to pay for an hour of training or go through any of that rigmarole. So keep the resources in mind. You know, it's a real good place to go looking for the answer to a question. So some of the return scenarios that we can come across here. Supplier sends us an item that either A, we receive a quantity that we didn't order. You know, hey, I ordered a 100-foot spool of rope, and look, the truck just came with 100-foot spools of rope. Or maybe I just ordered a box containing 4, and now I've received 4 boxes, each one containing 4. Now I have 16 items, way too many. I need to send some back. Or they send me an item that I didn't order at all. You know, I open up the box and, hey, look, there's the little frog garden feature that I didn't order that whatever supplier decided that I was going to go ahead and be receiving today. So we're going to talk about how to send some of those items back and track it in Paladin or not track it in Paladin, kind of depending on what your supplier likes you to do and what your preference is. And then finally, a customer returns a damaged or broken item that you didn't catch while receiving that into the store. It's been sold. It did not work as advertised. It has been returned to you. And now we want to get a credit for that from the supplier. Okay, so the first one here, how to return items or item quantities that you did not order. So first, let's talk about if you're receiving an item that you didn't even order. Maybe you never even sold it in the store before. That little frog water feature is sitting there, and you're like, what the heck am I going to do with this? It's the middle of winter. I don't want this item. Why did my supplier send me this? Well, what you can do, first, if we want to track, you know, you could always keep the whole thing outside of Paladin. If the truck's still there, you could just not take it off of the truck and put it in your store in the first place and never receive it into your store at all. But obviously, that boat has already sailed. We're past that point. We're now discovering that we've got this frog water feature that we don't want. But it's not in our system. So what I'm going to need to do first is I'm going to need to add it into the system. If this is an EDI supplier, by processing the receiving inventory invoice file, the invoice file that you receive, corresponding to the original purchase order that you sent off, right? That will have this information in there, and invoice files will add new items to your system. So if this is an EDI supplier that you're receiving the unasked for item from, the item will already be added into your system simply by processing that report. If you already have the items in your system, then obviously it's a moot point. If you are getting this from a non-EDI supplier, then you will have to go into the inventory module using the F2 button. I'm sure you are all familiar, and manually add the item. We can't track the returning of an item in Paladin unless that item is actually in Paladin. And if it's not coming from an EDI supplier, then it's not going to be auto-added by any sort of file processing magic that EDI can bring to the table, right? So you're going to have to go in there and add it. And then what you need to do is create a negative purchase order for the items. So you can go ahead and, after receiving the items into your inventory, pull up a purchase order in Paladin. I'm about to go into Paladin. We'll show you how to do this here. Very simple. If you've written a purchase order, it's literally just putting a negative in front of the quantity and sending that off to the supplier. Again, if this is an EDI supplier, every supplier is a little bit different, kind of have their own unique preferred method of doing this. Some suppliers can receive negative EDI files. Some of them cannot receive negative EDI files. So check in with your supplier to see if they can do this. But many of them can, so you can go ahead and process, write up a negative order, just like you would write up a positive order, send that to your supplier, and then a credit should appear on your account automatically without you really having to do anything. For everyone else that's a non-EDI, you're just going to do the same thing as you're making an order. Just make the order, except put negatives in front of the quantities that you don't want, and then send that off to the supplier. Call the rep, figure out the best way that their preferred method that you would do this, whether EDI, non-EDI, whether you fax it, email it, or simply just call them up and say, hey, I'm sending you this stuff back. I don't know why you sent it to me in the first place. So that's how to do for adding an item into the system if they sent you something that you didn't ask for. This is also how to receive, or how to send back items, just a massive quantity that you didn't want, where you ordered 4 boxes, or 1 box containing 4, and now you receive 4 boxes, each one containing 4. We want to send 12 of them back. Obviously, we don't need to add the item into the system. If this is an item I'm ordering, then it's an item that's already in the system. So simply create a purchase order, put a negative quantity in there, and send it back to the supplier. Let's go ahead and hop over to Paladin and make sure that we know how to do this here. There we go. Okay. So simply go to the purchase order module, select whichever supplier we're going to send this to, and then add your items that you don't want. Oh, not my keyboard. I'm just going to find any random item here. Extension ladder, sure. Let's say they sent me one of them. I just pressed F8 to add that item there. This, I've got my supplier selected here. The quantity that we were going to return, obviously this is a positive quantity. I want to put a -1 in front of this item. Or -11, however we want that to play. There we go. Now this is a negative purchase order, and we're going to send this to the supplier. Can the RF gun write a negative purchase order? Unfortunately, no, it cannot. But it can write a positive purchase order. So when you're receiving these items in, you can create a purchase order for the defective items. You will have to add in the additional step of coming back in here, finding the RF purchase order that you created, bringing it up, and then manually inserting a negative in front of each one of the quantities. So you can go ahead and do this with the RF gun. You just can't make the numbers negative. They have to be a positive number with the RF gun. Then you have to pull it up here back at home base in Paladin and add in those negatives. But you can do the same thing. So that's how we make a negative purchase order, and then you can simply, send it just like you always do here if there's a purchase order number your supplier wants to go to. And it's just a regular purchase order, just like you guys do every day to write and send your orders. Okay, so how to process a defective item that's returned by a customer. I'm going to go through this slide in my next one. Then we're going to hop back over into Paladin just because I want to make sure I didn't lose anybody. And we can actually take a look at how to do these things. So when a customer returns a defective item, Simply do the return, add the item to the invoice, and then there's a little DEF. Many of you have probably wondered what the heck does this box mean? You got your tax, your DEF, and your net, right? Tax is to tax the item. Net is to allow this item to be discounted, having it applicable to any automatic discount structures. And then DEF is defective. So if you're returning an item that is defective, it will not add the item to your stock on hand in the inventory module. It'll add it to the defective bucket. Make sure this item goes in the right spot, and we don't count it as stock on hand, and it throws off our counts, and we think someone stole one from us a little bit later, or what have you. There's all sorts of little trickle-down problems by not doing this the right way. So make sure we check the little DEF box. It'll go into the defective bucket. We have if you want to know more about defective items or just customer returns, we have Return to Sender on our help portal. Is a webinar that we did a few weeks back. And it really sinks its teeth into how to properly do a return and how to do this defective item or return an item as defective. But it's simply as easily as checking the little checkbox there, just check it, and now we've returned it in the defective bucket. And I'll go into Paladin here in just a second and show you guys this. But for efficiency's sake, I'm going to do the next one, and then we'll go back into Paladin and do both. So you can create a defective parts report that will show all of these items that is in the defective bucket, when it returned, and what the total is, and that sort of thing. Many times you can use this report to actually send to your supplier as a negative purchase order, really as opposed to the negative purchase order. You're saying, hey, these are the items that I'm sending you back. This is what I'm expecting you to credit my account or pay me, or however the supplier does that. So in the reports module, in the report area pane, click the inventory, then go to the general. In the report list pane, that'll be right to the right. Click the defective parts and click next or F12. Now, if this is something, I like running this report first just to make sure that it meets my expectations before doing this third optional step. There's a little checkbox there that says clear defective inventory items upon items upon completion. And what will happen if you do that is it will just zero out that bucket. So all of the items that are in your defective inventory will just be zeroed. So make sure that you are very deliberate in doing that, as we're going to disappear a whole bunch of negative inventory that perhaps we really want to get credit for, especially if it's a large high-priced item. We want to make sure we're not losing out on that, like my extension ladder or power tool that didn't work, something like that. So by checking that little box, that will go ahead and delete the stock on hand from that bucket, from the defective bucket, as if you already sent it back to the supplier, or maybe you threw it away, or whatever the supplier wanted you to do with it. You click the report, run it, and it'll show you. Let's hop over to Paladin here and take a look at it, make sure we're not losing anybody. There we go. Okay, so first, let's look, as promised, let's go ahead and do a a return of a defective item here. So let's say that someone brings me back this little 2-inch foam paintbrush, and they say, hey, didn't work out for me, you know, that it was broken, had a faulty handle, and it snapped on me, whatever the reason. I'm just going to go process this as a return. So -1. Now, there's different ways to do a return, of course, into Paladin, depending on whether the customer brings me the item to scan, right, or the receipt that I can scan the bottom and do that. A few different ways. We're not going to be covering that in this webinar. If you'd like to see all the different ways, the proper ways to handle a return, you can look at the last webinar, Return to Sender. So negative quantity right here. We're just going to do it the easiest way, which is, of course, just write up a negative invoice as a return. But as opposed to returning this to my regular inventory, I'm going to check this little box right here, DEF. Let's take a look at this item right here. So no defective items, stock on hand. I'm about to return this item right here as a defective. Got this little box checked. We'll go ahead and give the customer cash back. Now, let's refresh this over here. one in our defective. So that's not returned to my stock on hand, ready to be sold again. Nope, it returned it to my defective, ready to be sent back to the supplier. So now let's go ahead and create the defective items report. We're going to go over here to the reports module, go into inventory, and then general. Here it is, defective parts. Next. And then clear defective items upon completion. Let's go ahead and do that. You can send this to a PDF or summary to Excel depending on your preference or what you're doing with this. If we're trying to use this to send to the supplier, or maybe just export it to Excel so I can start tallying columns and figure out kind of some of my year-end stuff, how many defective items have we had returned, that sort of thing. Some fun analytics to play with. Let's go ahead and run this report. Over on my other screen, there we go. I've just got a few items in here just so you guys can see. Here we've got the item description. You know, as with all of our reports, we've got kind of the legend or the key up here on these tops so you can kind of see what's meaning what here. Stock on order, 1 defective, order quantity, all these good things. Defective stock value right here. Defective parts report grand total. So this should be what your supplier credits your account back or writes you a check for here if that's the sort of thing that they're in the habit of doing. All right, so finally here, how to return the defective items to a supplier. And this is not necessarily when we're receiving the items, because this is more when we've received them from the customer. Because if you don't receive the items into your store, you know, if you get a delivery truck and it's got a bunch of items on the truck that is defective, don't even receive those into Paladin in the first place. It's simpler to keep that entire process outside of Paladin and just don't receive those items. Keep them on the truck if you notice that they're broken. But if the truck has left the store, you know, call your rep, explain the situation to them. Each supplier has a little bit different preferred method that they want you to do, so it's always best to check with them and figure out what is the best way to do this. I don't think it's a very good idea to track all of this in Paladin. When you've received a bunch of defective goods and the truck has already left, I don't think that you should, you know, receive those items into Paladin, because there's no way to receive a defective item into Paladin in the purchase order module. You can only do that in the invoice quote module, right? So if you receive defective items and you want to track that into Paladin, you would have to create a purchase order or just receive them into your store. And then you would have to create some sort of fictitious account, sell them to that account, then return them to your store and mark as defective, and then you can go ahead and write your negative purchase order or whatever. I wouldn't do all that. I would just keep the items set aside to the corner, call the rep and say, hey, I got all this stuff here. What do you want me to do with it? I think that would probably be better than tracking that inside of Paladin. It just seems like a lot of excessive work. When you are, now if the defective items are returned by the customers, we do want to send that back to the supplier. Obviously, you know, the truck has way already left and we have nothing that we can do. We're kind of forced to do this inside of Paladin because we've received it into Paladin. We've sold it via Paladin. We've now returned it as a defective item into Paladin. I would create the defective parts report and then send that report to the supplier. I also have here create a negative purchase order, but I think there's be careful with doing that, because that will deduct from your stock on hand. That will not deduct from your defective parts. So if you created your defective parts report and created a negative purchase order, you're going to double dip. You're going to be returning stock on hand that is not defective. So if your supplier is okay with you sending them the report, I think the best way to do this, to handle these sort of situations, would be to create that defective parts report and then simply send that report to the supplier for an expected credit. And the supplier may want you to ship those items back. They may want you to just throw them away or do whatever with them. As lots of times they don't want to pay the shipping on an item that is broken, and they don't want to. They're not going to do anything besides throw it away. So why should they pay the shipping on it? I think is the mentality there. Okay, guys, so that's how we handle it here in Paladin. The Learn More page here, you can learn about returns for how to do all the returning in Paladin, or all the educational resources about returns, about defective items. Again, educational resources about defective items. And then the webinar Return to Sender, that's a real good resource for learning how to do proper returns inside of Paladin. let's make sure that we don't have any questions. Anyone have any questions? Question? Okay. I don't see any hands going up or any questions being typed out here, guys. So as always, you can call our customer support team, and you can ask for Chad if you'd like to speak with me directly. If you've got any follow-up questions on this, you can always send me an email at chadk@paladinpos.com. And and if we got anything else, then till next time, guys.